name's Jenny, and I'm here today to do my March wrap-up and my April TBR. March was a overall pretty good reading month for me. I ended up doing three read-along things, which took up a lot of my reading time in terms of March of the Mammoths, which is a challenge to read at least one book over 700 pages, I believe, or it could be 800 pages. So I did read that book. I actually just finished it last night, so I did go a few days over into April, and that book was The Rebels of Ireland by Edward Rutherfurd. This is the second in a duology called the Dublin Saga that Edward Rutherfurd wrote, and I think his Dublin Saga are, out of the several novels of his I've read, my favorites thus far. I think what he was able to capture in the history of Ireland was a really good variety of types of people, types of experiences that told the history of the island from the landmass forming until just after World War I, after the Easter Uprising, is where it goes until maybe a little bit longer. So maybe into the mid-1920s or something like that. And for me, being of Irish descent in one part of my family, I also felt quite a big connection to the story in that way. So what Edward Rutherfurd's able to do is just make really compelling stories, and I think the key that he did so well in the Dublin Saga, that was done fairly well in his Ruska novel, the novel of Russia, but I didn't find quite as effectively, was he was able to really develop these character traits and both physical and just different defining characteristics that kind of carried through each generation of the families that he features. It was particularly difficult to read about the famine years, as I'm sure everyone understands why that would be difficult to read about. And I believe my ancestors who immigrated to Canada, left around that time in that era. And so to think about the conditions that they may have been going through and to apply that to, in such a personal way to anyone who has to experience such terrible deprivation, and also to understand how many people from Ireland died during this famine, and not because actually there was a lack of food, is very frustrating and difficult to handle emotionally. But there's also, so many other periods that I learned about that were really interesting in this novel. So I'm really, really glad I read it, and I think for me this is the best way for me to consume history. Although I do think I will try to focus in on a few other points in Irish history and read a bit more nonfiction about those times. And I was reading that book for the Irish Readathon. The other book I was reading for the Irish Readathon is The Red-Haired Girl from the Bog by Patricia Monaghen. And this is, the subtitle of this is The Landscape of Celtic Myth and Spirit. And this, I would say, is it's also obviously nonfiction, and it's part memoir, part learning about Celtic goddesses mostly, and a kind of spiritual journey of returning to a place that your ancestors came from, but growing up in a different place. Patricia Monaghen grew up in Alaska. So there's a lot in here. I was reading this for artistic research, and I was rereading this actually. I've already read this previously. And reading this alongside of the Rebels of Ireland was very, very enhancing of the experience, because she was mentioning places and names and periods in history, but not delving into them very deeply. And so I was getting more of a picture of the history through the other books. So that they went really well together. And I think my reading of these two books this month took me on a bit of an emotional journey. Like I said, having ancestry from Ireland, and also trying to connect these kind of disparate ideas and possibilities. I think I don't know exactly the circumstances under which my ancestors decided to immigrate. I don't know how long those ancestors had been living in Ireland, whether they were Normans, whether they were Vikings descent, whether they were of British descent, depending of, I should say, English descent, depending on when they came to the island and made that their home, all those things. Understanding how fluid Europe was. I think, especially as descendants living in North America, we often assume it's very simple. You're either Irish or you're Scottish or you're German or whatever, and it's actually much more crossed over than that. There was a lot of immigration and movement over hundreds of years happening in Europe, and so it's not that straightforward that you're just from one place. And I think that really speaks to the kind of universal nature of humanity, how we all move and we all interbreed and we all come from different areas, and we've all been mixed up, and there's no real true, pure anything, because we're all mixed up. So yeah, those were two great reads. I was also reading two other books for research. I won't really go into them here. They were on labyrinths. So Walking a Sacred Path by Lauren Artress, and The Spirituality of Mazes and Labyrinths by Gayland McQueen. So those were both, I didn't really read them cover to cover. I more scanned them, read through, the chapters to see what information was important for my research, and extracted that, and then, didn't read the rest. But they were both good books for what I was using them for. My audiobook for March was I Am by Maggie O'Farrell, which is a memoir about 17 brushes with death. And I thought it was incredible. It was so compelling. She describes some really important aspects of life, such as experiencing miscarriage and going through a life-threatening childhood illness that I think are so well written, so lacking in regular literature. You just don't hear a lot of people talking about these types of experiences in such a raw and really authentic way to me, even though I myself have not gone through those experiences. But I just felt that her portrayal of these experiences was very, very it just touched my heart, and it made me feel very connected to her and her experience, and very moving. It was very, very moving. So I thought it was wonderful. As I said, I listened to it on audio, and I can't remember the narrator's name, but I will insert it. I think the only way it could have been better is if the narrator would have had an Irish accent, which they didn't. But I think, that's fine. Maggie O'Farrell did move around quite a bit. She lived in Wales as well when she was a child, so perhaps I don't have a memory of her accent at this moment, so I'm not sure what her accent sounds like, but I imagined it had a bit more of an Irish lilt to it. So I also read Clay's Arc by Octavia E. Butler. That was the third book in the Pattern Master series, and I'm doing that as part of the Octavia E. Butler slow read along with Onyx Pages and Musical Tati. And I definitely enjoyed it. It's always, I find that those books, like Octavia E. Butler's books, are really easy to pick up and put down. You don't have to read them, straight through in order to keep up with the plot, which is great because we were basically reading for 4 consecutive Friday nights, and they're not very long, the books, so that's possible to do and to not and to get them done in that length of time. So very much enjoyed the story. I was a little bit off in my description of it in my TBR for March. It doesn't actually connect specifically to a character. It's loosely connected to the previous character in book 2. It is much more, the plot centers on a alien organism that is brought to Earth through the body of one of the astronauts, and how that alien organism spreads through the population, or doesn't spread, as the case may be. So it is really interesting, and it was written, I believe, in 1980, but it's actually set in 2021. So that was a bit of a weird coincidence and a strange experience to be reading it at this time with the pandemic still going. So yeah, it was a really, really great read, and I'm excited to finish up that series in the next few months. Okay, so I also read The Whale Rider by Whiti Ihimeara. That is a New Zealand Indigenous story, and I actually talked about that book more at length in my movie-inspired reads video, which I did earlier in March, so I will link that down below if you'd like to read more about that, or hear more about that. I read that with my son Elliot, and yeah, it was a really great read. And then finally, the other book I was planning to read in March was The Witches of Eastwick by John Updike. And I started reading it, and it was fine. I don't know, I wasn't a huge fan of Updike's style, so there's a lot of words in his writing, and I just thought that it probably was not going to be a book that I loved. I was probably going to like it fine, but I also changed my reading plans a little bit near the end of the month because of the BookTube Prize results, and so I will get onto that. And the short of the story version is that I DNF'd The Witches of Eastwick. I got it out of the library on the expectation that I may not like it at all, and that I may DNF it, and that I would therefore unhaul The Widows of Eastwick by John Updike, which I've had on my shelf for many years, and I am going to do that. I think I could have tried harder to, read the book. It wasn't terrible, but it just wasn't something that I felt I was going to love, and therefore I didn't really want to take the time with it. Part of that being because of the BookTube Prize. Okay, so if you're not familiar with the BookTube Prize, I will link all the information about it down below, but it is a book prize, obviously judged by members of BookTube, and also people who make videos on BookTube, but also people who are part of the community and participate and are readers and commenters. And there's 6 books in each grouping, and I am in the fiction group this year, and I got Group A. So if you've watched my first BookTube Prize video from this year, where I talked about the long list, I talked about how I didn't feel like certain books should be included if they were part of a series. And my hope for the round 1 judges was that they would eliminate a certain series, which is the Wolf Hall Bring Up the Bodies, They're in the Light series by Hilary Mantel. And that didn't happen. Mirror in the Light went through, and that is the group that I'm judging. So I read Wolf Hall a few years ago, I think, in 2019, I believe. And so I don't like to read series back to back to back, although that has been fine with the Octavia Butler books. So perhaps I'm changing that a little bit now. But the problem with me getting The Mirror in the Light is that I haven't read the second book, Bring Up the Bodies. And so Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel is on my April TBR. I am very pleased to find out that Bring Up the Bodies is only about 410 pages, because that is a very manageable book for me to read this month. And I just, I did have a commenter on that BookTube Prize long list video say that they didn't have a problem with just reading that book as a standalone, because they felt that as a judge, they should be able to judge it on its own without having read the other books. And I totally get that. But for me, because I've already read the first one and I planned on reading the second one anyway, I don't feel comfortable jumping ahead and reading book 3. I really want to read book 2 and find out what happens. So that is happening. I'm going to be reading this book in April, and I will be reading The Mirror in the Light in May. So that'll all come out later for my May TBR, which books from the categories I'm reading. But you can always look that up in the announcement video, what other books are in book A, are in section A or group A. But Bring Up the Bodies, Hilary Mantel, for April. And this book centers on everything that goes on with Henry VIII during his time falling for Jane Seymour and falling out of love with Anne Boleyn and her subsequent murder, essentially, because, that is not a spoiler. If you don't know history, it's not. She gets murdered. So that is that. I am listening to The Death of Vivek Oji by Akwaeke Amezi on audio, which is also in that category. I'm very excited. This is my first Akwaeke Amezi, and I have one of her other books, Freshwater, on my 5-star predictions list. So that means I'm going to be reading 2 Akwaeke Amezi books this year, which is not a problem. I can't talk about how I feel about it yet at all. So that is what I'm going to be listening to that this month. Homeland, Elegies by Ayad Akhtar will be book 4 from the grouping that I'm going to be reading. And this is a book set in a post 9/11 world, and it goes through small town America, Central Europe, and Afghanistan. So it's got like a kind of a multiple setting look at identity and belonging and how that works when you are an immigrant in a nation or when you're returning to your home nation, I think, as well. So I am looking forward to this. I think, even though I didn't vote for this one, I think that this will fall in well with a lot of the themes of books that I'm reading right now around identity and home, ideas of home, and moving and traveling and moving to another place, and how that all connects back to your identity. So, yeah. And the other book I'll be reading for the BookTube Prize this month is Pew by Catherine Percy. And I believe Pew follows a non-gender conforming person who is discovered in a church pew in the southern United States, so kind of in the Bible Belt area, and how that person's life is attempted to be controlled by the members of the church that discover them. Also sounds really compelling and interesting. Okay, so that is what I'll be reading for the BookTube. read-along, readathon themed reading that I will be doing for April is #AussieApril, which is put on by Doris from Aldi Books and Jacqueline from 6 Minutes for Me. So I'm actually going to be reading 2 nonfiction books from Australia for this round. And you know, there's a lot of Australian lit on my TBR, so it's not very hard to choose. But going along with the research that I'm doing, one of the books that is on my research list is Finding Eliza, Power and Colonial Storytelling by Larissa Behrendt. And Larissa Behrendt is an Indigenous woman from Australia, and so she's writing about this particular story of Eliza Fraser, who was a white woman who was reportedly captured by the Butler people in 1836. And she's re-examining this story and trying to take the colonial lens off of it and look at it from an Indigenous perspective. And again, a lot of the research I'm doing is around ideas of colonialism, Indigenous relations with colonialists, and how that all plays out. So I think this will be really informative. I bought this several years ago. It was recommended by Shawn the Book Maniac on his channel. I believe he may have read this for AussieApril a few years ago. So really looking forward to this. I am assuming, she also is exploring literature in here. So different colonial literature such as Robinson Crusoe, Cunardoo, and some other books, I believe. So, you know, I think this is going to be really compelling read. And lastly, I'll be reading Tracks by Robyn Davidson, and this is a memoir. Robyn Davidson undertook a journey from the desert, the middle of, I don't know which part of Australia this is, but she started in this tourist camp and she traveled with 3 camels across the desert all the way to the ocean in Western Australia. And I believe she did this in the late 70s, early 80s. And I've watched the film that was made in 2012, I believe. And it was fantastic. I super enjoyed it. And so I'm really interested in hearing her story in her own words. I am craving traveling so much right now. These books are a salve to that for me, helping me to deal with the fact that I'm not able to travel right now. So really looking forward to hearing the story. She also takes care of the camels when they're injured. She has many encounters with the Indigenous people as she's traveling through their territory. So yeah, really, really interesting story. So that is my TBR for April. It is about typical of the number of books that I read in a month, so I'm not assuming I'm going to be adding more. There could be 1 or 2 more that get thrown in there depending on how much reading I get done. But that is it for now. I will be back again soon with another video. Thank you so much for watching.